Greetings.
Hi, everyone.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Welcome to Intelligent Disclosure. I'm Richard Dolan and my lovely wife, Tracy.
Hello, everybody.
So this is the closest we're going to get to Christmas with you, because a week from today will be Christmas Day. We won't be live next week, Christmas Day, you have to understand. So this is going to be the pre-Christmas extravaganza. And for those of you who don't celebrate Christmas, whatever you celebrate is fine by us. We wish you a happy holiday season.
Yeah.
So we've been working very busy. I'm going to get into some fascinating, kind of embarrassing piece of UFO history.
Oh, yeah.
All right. But before we do that, we have one or two quick things we want to go over. Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, we were just talking about what happened in the last week. And last time we were all here, we were saying that the History Channel had contacted us and wanted to film Richard for some historical background on Project Blue Book. So since we last saw you, that has happened.
Yeah.
History Channel was here, and I got a little bit of behind the scenes footage to share, and I put a little snippet of that in the newsletter if anybody wants to check it out. It's just a little 4-minute excerpt. But we had a great time. They were super nice, and I love that they want to sort of look at where the show took liberties and what stuck to historical truths. So
yeah, I mean,
that was admirable.
Exactly. So the History Channel's new TV show is called Project Blue Book. It airs in less than a month, January 8th. And it's a dramatization of the life of J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer and was a consultant for the Air Force's Project Blue Book. That was their UFO investigative office for about 20 years in the 50s and 60s. So it's an interesting show. We were shown all the screeners for it. We watched. And so their idea is they want to interview a few people. Myself, Jacques Vallée is another one. Paul Hynek, the son of J. Allen Hynek, is another one. I believe, I don't know if there's any others. It might just be the three of us who are being interviewed to provide historical commentary on each of the episodes. And in fact, they're going to air like a minute or so, not very much, at the end of each of the episodes on the network, and then longer versions of them on their website on the History Channel. So you can look into that. So it was interesting. They came over to the house and set up, and I answered questions all day about each of those episodes and the cases that they discussed. And so you'll be able to see that, and that's what Tracy was talking about that she recorded. And on our newsletter, you can just listen to a 4-minute clip of me talking. In this case, I was talking about the 1952 Washington UFO sightings, very famous, and which they covered in the series.
You get to see a little bit of back and forth with the producer and a little bit of behind the scenes with the camera and the sound guy. So it's kind of neat.
It's all interesting stuff. Yeah. I mean, most of the times people don't get to see that. And so what we did that day, I thought was very typical of how this type of thing goes. So like you sit in front, there's a producer, a couple of camera guys, an audio person. Producer asks some questions, and you do your best to answer as well as you can. And that's basically how it goes.
It's always fun to see a little bit behind the scenes, though, because we've seen you on Ancient Aliens, Hangar 1, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of nice, I think, just to see a little bit. So
it was fun.
Anyways, tomorrow we also have a live show that's going to happen at noon Pacific.
That's 3 Eastern.
3 Eastern. It's going to be a live Google Hangout with the creator of Project Blue Book, David O'Leary.
That's right.
So we're really looking forward to that as well.
He seems like an interesting guy. We caught another interview he did, and he's very engaging. I'm looking forward to it. I promised that I would send some questions in advance. Haven't done that. If you're listening, Mr. O'Leary, I'll do it tonight. But that will be tomorrow, and I've definitely got a lot of ideas and questions I'd like to ask and engage him with. So that should be, hopefully it'll be fun. And if you're around, you can watch that tomorrow.
And you can add, I don't know if we're going to get around to questions, but we will be watching the chat in case you do have questions for him, and we'll do our best to get them to him. So
yeah.
Good
idea.
But I love what we're going to be talking about tonight. It is related.
It's all about the closing of Blue Book, essentially, like what led to it, and the I would have to say pseudo-scientific study that is the University of Colorado project known as the Condon Committee that was such a rigged game, such an embarrassment to the scientific community, or at least it should be. But it was that study that led to the closing of Project Blue Book. And I've got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting that it was one of the major things that really sidetracked the UFO field, I think it sounds like. So
yeah, it was. And it was interesting. I was talking with Tracy about this earlier today, and you didn't know, you'd heard of it, but I think like a lot of folks, you didn't have a lot of detailed
didn't have all the
historical
details,
knowledge of
yeah.
it. And I think it interested you quite a bit.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting looking back at where what were the major accounts that sidetracked ufology, and so I was really pleased to sort of understand it better. And it makes me think, wow, if we really want to dig into something and pull it apart, this is a perfect thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Talking about looking into methodologies of studies, how studies are done, where the funding is, who's running the study, what the motivations are behind them. This is a perfect example
Absolutely.
of something for people to look into that did a lot of damage to this field. So anyhow,
you bet.
I'm going to let you get into
it. Are you going to go over there?
Yeah.
Is there room for you over there? I put some
Yeah.
tripods and things over there.
It's all good. All good. Okay.
If
so
you
welcome. I just want to say welcome everyone who's joining us from everywhere. So
if you see a tripod flying across the room, it's because Tracy needs space over there.
I think we're good.
All right. I'm going to slide over and I'm going to get started here.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, Fab. So yeah, welcome, and glad to be here with you. Yeah, they're talking about the Condon Committee report. This is of the late 1960s. I'll get into the details in just a moment. It's important because I'm enjoying this historical look back into the past, all connected with Project Blue Book. The Condon Committee is very intimately connected to Blue Book in that regard. I think in the future I may want to talk about Captain Edward Ruppelt. Those of you who follow the history of this, you know his name very well. He was another important person in the early years. But for tonight, I want to talk about the Condon Committee and essentially how science failed UFOs. Science did fail UFOs. And, let me roll this back to the situation as it was in 1966. So that's 52 years ago now. It's a long time ago. And what the situation relating to UFOs had been is essentially like this. UFOs had been in the public consciousness since the late 1940s through the 1950s. And there were always people who believed that this flying saucer phenomenon was real. There were those who thought, I trust the Air Force. They say that there's nothing to it. But the problem was it was a phenomenon that would not go away, obviously, no matter what the Air Force said about it. Project Blue Book was organized, and by the early 1950s was already in a formal policy of explain away, not even explain away. And this was a real directive coming down from the higher ups in the Air Force that they wanted the percentage of unknowns down to as near zero as possible, which meant that they started to get really creative with those explanations. And, in the earlier times where they would say such and such was a possible balloon and would list it as like an indeterminate sighting that wasn't necessarily explained, all the possibles then they just eliminated the word possible, and possible balloon in the future years just became balloon. Like, how do they know it was a balloon? Well, they didn't. They just, if there was a glimmer of a possibility that such and such a thing could be a weather balloon or a mirage of some sort or anything else, and they would just put that in. And so that did get the number of unknowns down very low. But the problem was UFO sightings continued to happen, and some of them were really good. By 1966, within the United States, UFO sightings had become actually quite prominent again and very problematic, to the point where the Air Force was not just embarrassed, because I think they were, but just annoyed beyond anything else. The Project Blue Book was this big albatross hanging around the neck of the Air Force in the following way. Like, the Air Force year after year could say There's nothing to UFOs. We've got this under control. But the problem was, from the public point of view, a member of the public could say, if that's so, why do you investigate them through this Project Blue Book? Blue Book was a public body. It wasn't classified. Everyone knew that it existed. And the Air Force couldn't really get out from under that question. If you're investigating UFOs, wouldn't that mean that there may be something serious to it? Otherwise, you're just wasting taxpayer money. So the Air Force, year after year, wanted to unload Blue Book. This was an old problem for them, but they were never able politically to find a way to give Blue Book to some other agency or just to close it down without a proper explanation. This was their problem. So now comes 1966, lots of UFO sightings. Air Force is desperate now. And so they look around. They look around and they find the University of Colorado, which had two individuals there that the Air Force really liked. One was a nuclear physicist named Edward U. Condon, and also working in Colorado at the university there was a gentleman named Robert Lowe. And I'll have more to say about Lowe in a moment, but for the time being, these two were the ones who were determined to be, they're going to run this project. It was going to be a scientific study of UFOs. The Air Force was going to pay the University of Colorado, it turned out to be about $500,000 and at the end of it, to conduct a formal scientific study of the UFO phenomenon. So in other words, take it out of the Air Force's hands. The Air Force is basically saying, in 1966, we're going to give this to a university, and they and their scientists are going to take the UFO reports and they're going to provide a genuine scientific analysis of it. And whatever they determine, we will take under our consideration and guidance. And that will determine, the future of Project Blue Book, whether we expand Blue Book or close it down or whatever. So everyone was like, yay, hooray, this is wonderful. Everyone in the late summer of 1966, when this all came down, fall of 66, whether it was Donald E. Kehoe, who I talked about Kehoe recently, he was the first true disclosure advocate that we had in UFOs research, or James and Coral Lorenzen of the group APRO, they were happy. Alan Hynek was happy. Even physicist James McDonald, who had become the best UFO voice of the 1960s by this time. McDonald was an atmospheric physicist out of the University of New Mexico and had become very forthright about UFOs and about how the government was covering up on it. Even McDonald initially thought, this is a wonderful thing. We're going to have a scientific study of UFOs. Great. The relief was very, very strong among everyone that we're going to have an academic, scientific study that had to be better than all of the ridiculous explanations that the Air Force had inflicted upon the public year after year. Well, very, very soon it became obvious that there was some trouble in paradise. I guess we can say that. Condon himself, early on, Edward Condon, who was the head of the project, starts making these public statements that really would have to make any impartial person wonder just what is going on here. So by early October of 1966, the project hadn't even started. They hadn't even begun their first investigation. And here's Condon being widely quoted in the newspaper saying it was, quote, highly improbable that UFOs existed. So here they haven't even done their first investigation. He says, actually, the view that UFOs are hallucinatory will be a subject of our investigation. Thanks. That's to all the witnesses of UFOs. That's just a real ringing endorsement. He says, we want to discover what it is that makes people imagine that they see things. Again, this is the project director. He said a lot more, like the Air Force had done a great job all these years. He was an openly strong supporter of the Air Force for all of this. And I think the other thing he said is like 95% of the UFO reports are pretty easy for us to identify. Again, saying this without having investigated a single UFO report at that point. He says, look, and even with more information, that other 5%, we could probably figure all that out too. So this is Condon right out of the gate of the project before a single investigation had been conducted. And by the way, the statements of Robert Lowe, who was the project coordinator, the number 2 man, were very similar. He disparaged UFOs publicly and said, but look, you don't say no to the Air Force. Condon, in fact, right away, privately to his colleagues, was already using the phrase, damn UFOs, pretty widespread, apparently. So that gives you an idea about his attitude. Right away, Dr. Alan Hynek and Dr. James McDonald, both of whom had actually great experience in researching and analyzing UFO reports, they offered, I should say, to participate in the Colorado study, and their applications, as it were rejected by the committee. And Lowe and Condon essentially said, look, we don't want people who have a prior history in investigating this. We want completely independent analysts looking into this. But the problem was those analysts had really no experience, no knowledge of the UFO phenomenon. So they went in with zero, not a single experienced researcher being involved. NICAP, organized by Donald Kehoe, was similarly rebuffed again and again. NICAP had an enormous number of UFO reports, good reports that they had collected over the years, thousands of them. And the Colorado committee was just completely pushing NICAP away the entire time of the project, so much so that midway through, NICAP had to disavow any endorsement and connection to the University of Colorado. So, and then you have reports immediately of Edward Condon sleeping through meetings, like literally sleeping through meetings, calling the subject nonsense. And actually, in one private moment with one of the scientists on the project, Dr. David Saunders, who later wrote a book about all of this, Saunders said that, in a private conversation with Condon said, look, if we actually, I'm not expecting a positive conclusion on this at all related to UFOs, but if we were to, I would take that in a locked briefcase to the president, not telling the public. Saunders thought that was a bit unusual, right? This is supposed to be a scientific study. This is not supposed to be politicized. And yet here is the project leader, Condon, telling Saunders any positive conclusion is not going to the public. That's going to the president only. So, in other words, this honeymoon that people had with the University of Colorado thinking, oh, this is going to be a great solution. That was a brief honeymoon, as you can see. So throughout the early period, before they did any investigations in November of 1966, they did have a number of outside researchers visit them, including Hynek and Jacques Vallée. Both of them got the distinct impression that Robert Lowe was the guy in charge, that Condon just did not care whatsoever about any of this. James McDonald gave an informal visit to the group. He wasn't invited formally. I think that's very telling. McDonald, meeting with some of these researchers saying, be prepared to find a great deal of evidence of Air Force obstruction and cover-up. Very interesting. Kehoe arrives there. This is all in Boulder, Colorado. He's taking the number 2 at NICAP, Richard Hall, with him, and they give a little bit of a brief presentation. And Kehoe's talking with Robert Lowe, and I think this is very telling about how the project was going. Kehoe says, look, I've got a ton of these NICAP reports here for you. Lowe's not interested. Kehoe says, I've got a great case from Redmond, Oregon in 1959. And in fact, I studied this case myself. It's an amazing UFO incident that involved multiple ground witnesses, radar, fighter jets intercepting, Air Force lies and obstruction, and then finally an admission Really an amazing case altogether. Kehoe says, I've got a lot of detailed information on this. Lowe says, nope, don't want that. Too old. 7 years old at the time. Lowe says, well, no one's going to remember anything. It's too far back. And Kehoe is just astonished at this attitude. And it became clear to him, and in fact, it became very openly said that this committee was not going to review nearly any of these historical cases. They said, look, anything that's more than a couple of years old, we don't want to do. So we're just going to focus on cases that are happening now. And that's really problematic because, first of all, how do you investigate current UFO cases? Do you just send your scientists out into the field immediately with what? Basically, all they had was a tape recorder. They didn't have any sophisticated instrumentation really to work with, you know? And in almost any case, like, are you going to be able to get to a genuine sighting within even a week of it happening? Chances are very limited and very low that would be the case. In reality, the Colorado study did end up taking a few historical cases, and I'll talk about those later. But it became very, very clear to Kehoe and to other people that this was not going to be the kind of wonderful scientific study that people had been hoping for. And in fact, really what it looked like, it's very clear in retrospect, is that there were some good researchers involved in the Colorado project. But you really can't help but conclude that this is a committee that was really sitting on their hands for a lot of the important things that were going on. Unfortunately, the wave of intense UFO sightings that happened in the United States subsided quite a bit, as far as we can tell. There was a massive wave that was going on at that time in South America. But of course, how are they going to get down to South America to do this investigation? That wasn't happening. The UFO phenomenon wasn't really cooperating with the University of Colorado's team. But what was really interesting is just the attitude again. So Robert Lowe, during August of 1967, so at this time, you've got a couple of scientists trying to do some investigations here and there. Lowe goes on a vacation. He goes to Prague, Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain into the Soviet bloc. And he's for a group of an astronomical conference. He's not an astronomer, but he goes anyway. And while he's there, he doesn't bother to meet with some of the leading UFO researchers in Europe. There were several who wanted to meet with him. He doesn't do that. Instead, he takes a trip to Loch Ness to visit the Loch Ness Monster for real. And his reasoning, he said privately, is because neither the Loch Ness Monster nor UFOs existed. So why not just go to Loch Ness? That was his attitude. Now, by 1967, one of the project members was going through some of the back files of the project and found a memo written by Robert Lowe that was rather inflammatory and sensational. It was a memo that Lowe had written a little over a year earlier when they were considering whether to do this UFO study. And Lowe was talking about this, saying, this is really going to be problematic if we do a UFO study. He says, this is an exact quote, the trick would be to describe the project so that to the public, it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of scientists, a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. That was his words. So in other words, this is not a scientific attitude, clearly. Lowe is saying, look, if we take this project, we have to make it clear to scientists that we don't believe in this and we don't expect anything to come out of it because otherwise our reputations are going to be in the tank. That's essentially what he was saying. So the memo, is privately being circulated among members of the project who had already been developing serious reservations about the objectivity of the project, about Condon, about Lowe. Now, a little bit about Robert Lowe. Robert Lowe was a guy who, when I was studying UFOs years ago, I was reading a lot of other books on the intelligence community, and I learned something that I don't think anyone else had learned about Robert Lowe, which was that he had a long history as an intelligence officer, an operative in the United States intelligence community, and apparently for the CIA itself. Robert Lowe, in fact, did clandestine CIA operations back in 1948 in the nation of Albania. And one of the people he worked with, incidentally, was a very famous operative by the name of Kim Philby, who was a British spy and turned out to be one of the most famous double agents in history. Philby was secretly working for the Soviet Union, that is the Russians, but was a British agent. Robert Lowe worked with him way back in the 40s. Leaves the intelligence community, I guess, leaves, who really ever leaves fully, goes to Colorado eventually, and now happens to be the number 2 person in this allegedly scientific study of UFOs. You know, the number 2 spot in a lot of these types of organizations has been referred to by one old friend of mine as the spook spot. And, you know, what he meant by that is if you want an organization to be working with the CIA, you don't usually make the number 1 person connected to the CIA. It's the number 2 person. It's the person behind the scenes who doesn't get a lot of the attention, who is actually running the program. And by all accounts, Lowe was actually the guy running this program, not Condon. So that's Lowe. His memorandum is now leaked to the public. And one other thing I just want to mention about Robert Lowe during this whole period, at the later part of 1967, is that he himself leaked information about James McDonald, probably his greatest foe at the time. He leaked this information to Philip J. Klass, the world's leading UFO debunker at the time, about McDonald's UFO-related research in Australia. McDonald had gotten a grant from the Navy, from the Office of Naval Research, to study in Australia. And McDonald was an atmospheric physicist, and the research was listed as, you know, relating to that. But everyone in the world knew that McDonald was focused on UFOs, including the Navy, including ONR, the Office of Naval Research, which had its own interest longstanding in UFOs. It's very clear that everyone kind of knew what was going on there. They gave McDonald some money to study UFOs in Australia. Lowe leaked that information to Klass. Klass then began this vicious letter-writing campaign, smearing McDonald, writing to ONR saying, how are you publishing, paying for research for this guy to do UFO research in Australia? Because of Klass's position, he was an editor with a very prominent publication, Aviation Week, in Washington, very well connected. Some people feared Philip J. Klass, and Klass made all these other, statements against McDonald's integrity, and even implying that McDonald was a habitual liar, which was, unbelievable slander. But anyway, all of that was leaked by Robert Lowe, second in charge at the Condon Committee, to Klass, simply to smear McDonald. This is the nature of the Condon Committee. All right, this supposedly scientific study of UFOs. So anyway, the Lowe memorandum circulating among the members of the project through 1967, and it finally is leaked to Donald Keyhoe. The existence of this memo was leaked by David Saunders, one of the members, tells Keyhoe about this memo. Keyhoe then told McDonald by the end of 1967 or so. And McDonald he's got a full head of steam here. And by February of 1968, McDonald is writing to the program saying, indicating that he knew about the existence of the memo. He says, well, it must make sense to you guys, but seems a little odd from over this perspective, something like that. and Robert Lowe blew his stack. Condon begins bringing all of the major, all the people in the program, interviewing them one by one. Did you leak this memo? Did you leak this memo? It was this huge thing. By the end of the day, in February of '68, a number of the members were fired from the project, including Saunders, including several others. And it was a combination mutiny and mass firing that had taken place. And behind all of it, we have to understand, it wasn't simply that they leaked this memo. It was that they leaked the memo because it was very clear that the leadership of this supposedly scientific program or project was not scientific. It was intensely political. And this disturbed many of the members of the program. These were PhDs who worked at the University of Colorado. They went in with the assumption that this will be a genuine scientific study. We're not going to have a foregone conclusion going in. So the whole thing came out in the press, major public relations embarrassment for the university. The remainder, what was left of the University of Colorado team, a couple of new people were brought in. They end up cobbling together a very sloppy report, which most of which actually didn't even contain any of the genuine UFO investigations that supposedly were being done. It was all padding, really. And they ended up with an unexplained ratio of roughly 30%. 30%. I want to talk about that in just a moment. But I would like to emphasize one other interesting thing about this. There's another political angle to the Condon Committee, which was that Condon himself was had been a real political enemy in the years past of Richard Nixon. And in 1968, Nixon was not president, but Nixon was running for president. The president was Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, a Democrat, which Condon was. Condon wanted to make sure that this report would get out before Nixon entered the White House in January of 1969. And that in and of itself is not anything unusual or may not mean anything, except for the fact that you see this, again, this political component coming into what's supposed to be an independent scientific study. So in any case, Condon, they published this report at the end of 1968, and his recommendation is that UFOs are not of probative value to science. That is, science will gain nothing from the study of UFOs. Science has gained nothing from the study of UFOs and is unlikely to gain anything in the future study of UFOs, and that the Air Force should really get rid of Project Blue Book, media coverage, totally sycophantic, lazy, and so forth. So I just would like to expand a little bit on some of what Condon said and what was in the report to give you an idea of just how awful this whole report was. So Condon, it's very evident that he didn't really read most of the report. I think that's definitely must be said. He wrote two little sections of the book, two little small chapters. And in addition to what I just stated earlier, he's says, well, people have claimed that the UFO subject has been shrouded in official secrecy and so forth. He says that's not true. There's no cover-up, and a cover-up, in fact, would be impossible, he says, because no one could keep such a secret for so long. And there would be no useful purpose that would be served, he said, by secrecy. You read these statements and you just think, what? What universe do you live in, Edward Condon, that you could say such a ridiculous thing, such an intellectually insulting thing, that there's no cover-up would be possible and no useful purpose would be served for it. Clearly a man who has not put a great deal of thought into this matter at all. There was even a claim, and he refuted this in the book. He says that the CIA had installed one of its own agents within the project. And when you consider the history of Robert Lowe as a CIA covert operative in the 1940s, you really have to just marvel at the surreal nature of that denial. And again, Condon's trying to explain why we didn't want to use too many old cases because they don't have any value. You know, there's nothing to analyze other than witness testimony, and everyone knows that witnesses are pretty useless. And he essentially was saying this, you know, because most witnesses, if you, you know, get deep into what people think they saw, you can prove that they didn't see what they think they saw. So what this really meant was ignoring the most compelling cases of the previous 20 years. And he stated, you know, they were just going to focus, and they did focus almost exclusively on reports that occurred during the term of the program. And again, this is very unsatisfactory because in most cases, the scientists going out onto the scene didn't have anything more than a tape recorder. Condon explicitly said that most of these UFO investigations were a waste of time. And then he said another really silly thing, in my opinion. He's openly wondering why, if aliens were here, why didn't they just announce themselves? You know, the whole matter of alien visitation would be settled in a few minutes, he wrote. And he said explicitly, if a flying saucer were to land on the lawn of a hotel where a convention of the American Physical Society was in progress, and its occupants were to emerge and present a special paper to the assembled physicists, revealing where they came from and their technology. Like, here's a physicist saying, yeah, we're not really going to investigate the phenomenon. We would, it'll all be settled if the aliens just came to one of our meetings. Like, this is, again, is the attitude. This is very, very telling. Within the report itself, there were, officially speaking, there were 59 distinct cases that were mentioned in the Condon Committee, but in fact, a number of those were multiple cases within. So it was roughly closer to 90 actual UFO events that were studied. Still not very much when you consider that there were, even by then, upwards of 20,000 or more actual cases that had been reported. So they're studying really the smallest handful, unfortunately. One of the individuals who was part of the Condon Committee was William Hartman, who was the expert on photographic evidence, or at least he wrote the report on photographic evidence. Hartman actually mentioned two specific cases that were really good cases that passed all of the tests, you know, of not being a hoax, not being a misidentification of something else, not being a hallucination, and so forth. One of them was a series of pictures taken in 1950 in McMinnville, Oregon, famous images of a UFO that were very well publicized at the time. And Hartman was quite impressed by this, and he wrote, "This is one of the few UFO reports in which all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, and physical, appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery, metallic, disc-shaped, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial, flew within sight of two witnesses." This is what he wrote in the report. He goes on, he says, "It cannot be said that the evidence positively rules out a fabrication, although there are some physical factors such as the accuracy of certain photometric measures of the original negatives which argue against the fabrication." So all of this he's saying looks real, looks artificial, looks like a flying saucer. Indeed, in the photograph, it looks exactly like a flying saucer. But Hartman, even here, he couldn't go all the way, could he? He says, no matter how strange or intriguing, it's always possible to explain this either by hypothesizing something very extraordinary or by a hoax. And so he leaves it at that. Like, no matter how good the case is, he says you can always say, yeah, could be a hoax. Leave it at that. There was another one, a case from 1954, one of the other historical ones that they looked at by British Airways. And this is an incredible case, actually. And these British commercial pilots, they had clear visuals back then on what seemed to be several craft. A fighter was sent to intercept the objects. That fighter got a radar fix on the objects. And so it was a really good case. So this analyst of the Condon Committee was named Gordon Thayer, and he says, look, the fact that the commercial plane did not get any radar suggested to him that there was a mirage. Like, that's really bizarre. You have good visuals by the commercial pilots. You got a visual and radar by a fighter pilot, but the commercial pilots didn't get a radar. So that fact makes you think that this was a mirage. And he went on. He said, well, there is a problem with this explanation because the only thing that might explain a mirage, he says, is an extremely thin and sharp temperature inversion. What that means is you had to have a radical change in temperature within like a centimeter in the atmosphere, a temperature change that was very, very dramatic. And he says this is his quote: "This unusual sighting should therefore be assigned to the category of some almost certainly natural phenomena, which is so rare that it apparently has never been reported before or since." So that's his explanation for that. Again, this gives you an idea of how threadbare scientifically, I mean, even beyond threadbare, actually non-credible explanations scientifically that were being offered by the Condon Committee to explain away a phenomenon that they simply could not acknowledge had a reality. There were a number of these other types of radar cases where, again, you'd have to have this drastic temperature change in the atmosphere, on the order of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within the space of a centimeter or an inch. Thayer really seemed to like these temperature inversion explanations, not credible. But there was one that he had a really hard time explaining away, and this is another of the historical cases. Really, the strongest ones were these historical cases. This one was a British case from 1956, Lakenheath, UK. In fact, I've talked about this one recently in one of these live streams. This is a case from August of 1956. It involved an RAF fighter being tailed and trying to chase an unidentified object. And Thayer's trying to think through all the explanations of this, and he's thinking atmospheric conditions. Didn't seem like it, he said. And he wrote, "This is the most puzzling and unusual case in the radar visual files." And he writes, "The apparently rational, intelligent behavior of the UFO suggests a mechanical device of unknown origin as the most probable explanation of this sighting." And you have to wonder if Condon even read this to say that UFOs offer no scientific value. Here's Thayer writing this. But even this was too radical for Thayer. So he had to say, well, there is the inevitable fallibility of witnesses, which keeps alive the possibility of a conventional explanation. Aside from the fact that there were multiple witnesses from multiple geographic locations in that particular case with multiple radar trackings and everything else, he's like, nope, even so, maybe people just made a mistake. So again, that's the attitude. So when you look at each of these 59 case studies as a unit, the report produced 16 of these cases in which the origin could not be determined in any way. They had to consider it unknown. So that's roughly 30%. Of those 16 cases, I would say, and I've looked at this very carefully, about half of them, about 8 of them, could be considered good cases, and 2 of them could be considered extraordinary. And I would just say this: if only those 2 extraordinary cases, all right, and by the way, if you want to do your homework, numbers 2 and numbers 46 in the Colorado Committee report are really extraordinary. If only those 2 are included, you are still left with an unexplained rate of 3.4%. In other words, the Colorado project produced results that were basically identical with those of the Air Force, with those of NICAP, with those of APRO, with the difference that this committee was charged with conducting its study in a more rigorous manner, which it certainly did not do. And so, in other words, they ended up with results exactly the same as what everyone else had been coming up with, which, I mean, everyone knew from the beginning that most UFO sightings are explainable. Like, everyone knew this all along. 95%, you hear this to this very day, that 95%, fill in the number you want. Is it 80%? Is it 90%? Is it 95%? Is it 97%? But everyone also knows that of those UFO reports, there remains a small residue of cases that are really difficult, maybe virtually impossible to explain conventionally. That is the UFO phenomenon, not the easy ones to explain away. So the fact that the Condon committee came up with exactly the same results as every other study had ever come up with, that is a certain hardcore percentage of unknowns, well, what does that tell you? It tells you that they didn't do anything unusual. In fact, they were no better and actually no worse than most of the other groups that had been studying this. So despite the fact that they tried, the Colorado project did not get the strikeout, which is what they wanted. They were really trying hard for it. It's ironic. Condon had said, all these UFO cases lacked probative value in his, highfalutin language there, right? But the fact is that the report itself lacked value as a definitive statement of the UFO phenomenon. So there you have it. Now, as a result of this conclusion, you have a situation in which, a 900-page report is released and published as a book. It's obvious that the media did not read the book. They only read Condon's conclusion, which was less than 20 pages. They release it to the public in the beginning of 1969. They get a glowing review from the National Academy of Sciences, the official scientific body in the United States, which also tells me that the academic and scientific community was clearly not doing its job in reviewing this evidence. The Air Force was not slow to take a hint, and they said, because of the conclusions of the University of Colorado project, we are going to drop Project Blue Book, which they did at the drop of a hat. Now, a couple of interesting things about this. The Air Force, there was an Air Force general later in the year named Carol Bollender. And he wrote a memo, which some of us consider famous within the UFO field, Bollender memo, from October of 1969. And he's talking about, and I've got it right here in front of me, he says, no evidence that Project Blue Book reports have served any intelligence function. Now, that's a classified memo, and actually that's really quite true. Project Blue Book, as everyone had come to understand, was really nothing other than a public relations effort by the Air Force. I mean, most of Blue Book's history, you had one officer and a handful of staff writing reports. And some of their ridiculous public relations images have a picture of the solar system in their office. I grew up with a picture, that exact poster in my room. Like, how is a picture of the solar system supposed to mean anything? It's ridiculous. Clearly, this is not a team that was able to do any kind of genuine investigation. How could it have intelligence value? But then Bollender goes on, and he writes, reports of UFOs, which could affect national security, are made in accordance, and then he cited a couple of regulations, and are not part of the Blue Book system. In other words, closing down Project Blue Book did not mean that the Air Force or any other military agency, for that matter, would cease to study UFOs. All it meant is that the public relations effort known as Project Blue Book was going to go away. In other words, the result of this was actually a real failing of democratic rule here, as I see it. The Condon report removed UFOs, in a sense, from the realm of public government interaction. Project Blue Book may have been a joke of an operation, and for most of its history, it really was. But it was, you might say, our joke. It was paid for by taxpayers, and it was, at least in theory, responsible to those taxpayers. And Blue Book had always provided this wedge for researchers to try to dig into the UFO reality. And by removing Blue Book, what the Air Force really succeeded in doing was to remove this embarrassing office that was being used by some UFO researchers to point out elements of the UFO investigation, which they absolutely didn't want. If you're trying to have a secret investigation, the last thing you want is the public looking in on what you're trying to do. And so, and essentially what the Condon Committee did is it did the work of the Air Force for it. And everything, in my view, points to the fact that this was a rigged game from the beginning. Condon's attitude from the beginning, Robert Lowe's whole position, and incidentally, after the release of the Lowe memo to the public, Robert Lowe was removed from the project, but he had played a very powerful role, domineering role over the project for most of its operation. So all of this points to a clearly politically motivated study that was posing as a scientific study. And what's tragic, honestly, is that to this day, the Condon Committee is used as the justification by the world of academia, by the world of science, to keep UFOs out of their little intellectual world. When anyone wants to study UFOs in a serious way within the academic community, one of the things that's brought out to this day is the allegedly definitive conclusions of the Condon Committee. The problem is when you look into the details of how that committee operated, you see a charade, you see a sham of a scientific operation. It wasn't a genuine scientific operation, not even close. But they got the job done. Like, it got the job done. It was messy. It was embarrassing to those at the time. It caused public relations problems, but ultimately it ended up in the closing of Project Blue Book, and it ended up really destroying NICAP as an organization. NICAP's membership plummeted as a result of this denial of UFOs. The mainstream media comes out. There was no alternative media back then. Mainstream media comes out and says, nope, no more UFOs. And it seemed like, for a few years anyway, that UFOs were gone. There was no UFO phenomenon. As you find when you look into the history, is that whoever was operating these objects, these aliens and extraterrestrials, they apparently didn't get the memo that they're not supposed to exist, because they continue to be seen, they continue to operate, they continue to be recorded. And we learned by the late 1970s, after the end of Vietnam, after the Watergate scandal, after the strengthening of freedom of information, we learned that military agencies and other intelligence bodies were, in fact, not only studying UFOs, but were really puzzled and at times disturbed by this phenomenon. None of that stuff made it to the public when the Air Force announced the termination of Project Blue Book, thanks to the awful, embarrassing effort, really scientifically speaking, of the Condon Committee, that is the University of Colorado UFO project. A travesty. And I would challenge any scientist to this day who would cite that study as justification for their position on UFOs to think again, look long and hard at that study. And it's really not difficult these days to find really good information on just how bad the Condon Committee was. So there is no excuse at this point. 50 years later, 50 years have gone by. And, you know, you've got scientists out there who are just clueless about this, using that report as their justification. So that's a shame. What do you think?
Definitely. Absolutely.
Want to come back out here?
Yeah, for sure.
Let's do
Can I
this.
give you this?
I will take your laptop. So what's happening? What's shaking?
So what would you say are the top, like the top 3-4 things that sidetracked?
What, ufology just in general?
Yeah, obviously class was part of that.
Oh, well, Philip Klass was a. Well, let me just think here. So I think the Condon Committee was a real a moment of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
In the 60s, the UFO phenomenon kind of mirrored what happened in general in the 1960s, in the sense that for a little while there, it seemed like anything was possible, kind of like the 60s. For a little while there, it seemed like things could go in all different ways. And kind of like the 60s, it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't go all, and the crisis was the Condon Committee, and it was a real key moment in which there's a turning point that could have happened, and it was the turning point at which we failed to turn. You could say that.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are others. I would go back and look at the late 1940s and say that this was also a moment in which things could have gone a different way, when the secrecy was just starting. I think of things like Roswell, that event, the events of 1947. There's no evidence to me that the people in the highest levels of decision making were considering revealing the UFO phenomenon to the world, but it was a moment where I would think that had to come up as a decision, and the decision for deep secrecy was taken.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand why, actually, but nonetheless, they made that decision. A couple of other areas where we got sidetracked. I guess I would say 1952 was another one where things could have gone. 1952, we've talked about this on this show before, was a year in which UFO sightings, like in 1965 and 66, were really, really prominent.
Mm-hmm.
And there were definitely people within the hierarchy who believed that the public needed to know what was going on. In fact, they were really wondering, this may just get out of control. Like the aliens just might land openly and we're screwed, and we've got to. And I think that was coming up as well. But I think I might list the Condon Committee as the number one failure.
Yeah.
Because so much hope had been invested into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a sham of an investigation.
You would think that would have almost broken Kehoe after.
Oh, you mean in terms of disappointment?
Yeah.
It kind of did. It kind of did. Like he remained same guy of integrity and belief, but it broke his organization, and it really, in the aftermath of it, he was removed from NICAP, from his directorship by the end of the year, by a CIA faction within NICAP, incidentally.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think the Condon Committee might just be, maybe the number one historical moment in which ufology failed to turn at the turning point where it could have. Yeah.
Okay.
Could be.
Might be interesting if to see where Project Blue Book is thinking of heading in their future seasons.
Oh, the series.
As well. There's so much there that they can draw from, and we'll wait and see what David says tomorrow. But because we've seen it, I have so many questions. But we'll just have to.
I'm going to say this: like I think it's a good series. I'm going to poke a little bit of fun here, because they do kind of turn Hynek into kind of this like superhero investigator. And I'm like, come on, but you got to keep in mind, all right, this is TV. They're dramatizing. And so for those of us who really know a deeper level of the history, we're thinking he was an astronomer. He was a consultant for Blue Book. He worked at a desk. He wasn't Fox Mulder. So that's the one thing.
I think that's the point, though, that he wasn't Fox Mulder. He was someone else.
But on the show, like, he's kind of like
Yeah.
portrayed as a fox mole. That's all I'm going to say. It's like, it doesn't even bother me. I think it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
They're taking dramatic license. The important thing from my point of view,
Mm-hmm.
as looking at the UFO story, is do they treat the UFO cases well?
Right. And
I mean, I think overall the answer to that is yes.
mm-hmm.
There were some liberties that are taken.
Mm-hmm.
Dramatic license is taken. I'm just giving you a heads up, everyone. But the show is well written.
Yes, it is very impressive.
It's a good it's a good script, and the plots are decent, and I think it's a satisfying show overall. I think people will probably like it. Look, it's going to be, anyone out there can nitpick anything
right.
to death. Like, that's just
right.
a given.
Right.
And in UFOs, it's easy.
Yeah.
And there will be people who want to do that. But again, I would say that this is an effort that's done by, the impression I get from O'Leary is that he's really enthusiastic about the subject.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I look forward to that tomorrow.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at a couple things here. I just want to hit this. A few people were asking about the Lazar documentary, and I saw people asking about Lear, whether he was a disinfo agent. And I thought it might be worth saying that we were just listening to a new talk that Grant Cameron is doing at the Rochester UFO meetup. And we were talking about having him on to sort of discuss this. He's got some thoughts that are quite interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think it would be a good idea. Grant Cameron, I mean, a lot of folks know Grant, of course, but what they may not realize is he was investigating Area 51. He's been investigating Area 51 as long as anyone, as long as George Knapp. All right. Now, I mean, George has really gone deeper and interviewed many, many more people because he's out in that area. But Grant has been doing deep analyses of Bob Lazar and of the Area 51 thing since 1990. And he's, hasn't really stopped. So he has a lot to say about this. And we Skyped him in about a week ago for the Rochester UFO meetup, which, by the way, Rochester UFO meetup, great group of people. We've been meeting for over 10 years, and it's really fantastic. And we'll have guests of all time. We lots of guests. Anyway, Grant was our Skype guest last week, and he gave a very good lecture, and he talked quite a bit about Lazar. Yeah,
he really has this long overarching view and theory of what's going on. And
and rather than like give it all away, but Grant, I think, has a sophisticated attitude about disinformation. So, and I agree with him. He's basically saying, when we're asking, is this real or is this true or is this false? I don't think that he looks at it that way. So there is such a thing as a kind of limited hangout. That is information that is intentionally put out there, but put out in such a way that there's deniability to it.
Right.
So that the group that puts it out can run away from it and not have to own it. So the information goes out there like an orphan. And that does a couple of things. That you could say that's a form of disinformation, or you could say it's a form of acculturation, or you could say it's a form of CYA, cover your ass, and put information out there. So I think, we should have Grant.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it's not so black and white. There's a lot of nuance, and he really sort of details that nuance.
It's frustrating sometimes, and I'm not going to mention any names. It's not fair, but there are folks out there who are so black and white about some of these elements in the UFO phenomenon. So whether it's the MJ-12 documents or the Majestic documents or any other element, they'll say hoax, and that's all nonsense. It's all disinformation. And I just think I've never been like this with any element of the UFO subject. I
think that's why we're all here. No, that's why we're here. I think it's a good place to look at all this.
I mean, to see things in black and white terms is how kids do things. And I really believe, like, as an adult, we should be able to get past that to some extent and realize that there's a lot of nuance in this information that's coming out. So, like, let's look at that and let's look at it carefully and find out what we can learn rather than to dismiss it all or accept it all as well.
Mhm.
We're so quick wanting to look for answers, definitive answers, but I think that there's a lot of clues in some of this info. So with Grant, yeah, let's bring him. We haven't told this to you, Grant, if you're listening, but we're going to bring you back on, and
That's
we're
right.
going to have a nice little convo.
Yes, we've been planning it. You just didn't know about it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think we'll be able to do
and
that.
I saw someone in there saying, "Yay, Grant and the aviary." And they really want us to talk to Grant about that. So,
Yeah, that's something that I'm quite interested
yeah,
in
I
as
think
well.
I think that'd be really cool. So,
Right.
let's
Good.
see.
Anything else here?
Yeah, Brian Hoffmeister. This is just something I grabbed earlier. Glad Richard is talking about this report. I read it in middle school and could tell how far off it was from the data Condon's conclusions.
Yeah.
Condon's conclusions were. It was so obvious that I was amazed that the media missed it. So.
Yeah,
yes,
well, you were
definitely.
amazed then in middle school. I'm sure you're less
Yeah.
amazed now.
Yeah.
We've all gone through our own learning curve and through the years, right? Isn't it funny? I remembered as well, the pre-internet era. And back in those days, there was no real alternative media. Isn't it crazy to think of it? I remember being 15 years old and reading, you're going to laugh, reading U.S. News and World Report. I had a subscription to it when I was 15. And I look back and I think, wow, well, at least I was earnest and I, thought that I was doing the right thing. But what else was there? It was the 1970s, and this is all that there was available to me. So I would read that stuff. But we didn't have any idea back then, most of us, that there could be deep complicity by the media with all of this. What we've now learned, at least those of us who care, is that there is an operation known as Mockingbird. It went for decades. And I am sure that Mockingbird was only one tip of the iceberg. I have no doubt. But Mockingbird was a CIA media manipulation program in which they had people on the payroll within major media doing their work. And back then, those journalists could tell themselves that they were doing the work for the country. They were doing patriotic work. And sure, but the fact was they were making up stuff for the CIA on behalf of them and not on behalf of the public. So they were spinning the news and sometimes creating literally fake news back in the 50s and 60s for the CIA. It's an amazing thing. I mean, this is slightly off topic, but I just have to say, when we hear the media, I'm talking about mainstream media, talk about fake news, it just astonishes me the gall that they have to think that they can get away with saying this. They are the creators of fake news. They always have been.
Mhm.
They have always been, but they have been able somehow, successfully for the most part, to turn it around to alternative media. People like us that implying that we're the purveyors of fake news.
Yeah.
It's galling a little bit. It's funny a little bit. And it just makes you throw up your hands a little bit and think, what is going on? But anyway, that's the whole thing. The news media was utterly complicit with what the Air Force wanted. And, honestly, there's really never been much of a difference. The only variation back in the 40s and 50s and 60s is that there was still certain independent newspapers and independent radio stations that were out there. They were really the closest that you could get to alternative media back then. And what you see through the 60s and 70s and 80s is the consolidation of those formerly independent sources. And the only thing that broke that consolidation was the development of the internet. But now what we're seeing is that the internet too is, of course, coming under much, much greater levels of control. I mean, to the point where, we're on YouTube, and the fact is YouTube is not stable. And that's the fact. I'm waiting for them to start looking at me more carefully. Right now, UFOs are not under the shadow banning thing that's going on. But who's to say? It's not going to happen down the road.
I wonder why that is.
You wonder why? What is?
Why that is? Well, I mean,
why it isn't yet? Or
a lot of us are suspicious that this is that, a little bit of chirp disclosure. Like, why is it being allowed? now,
Well,
So
the thing is,
perhaps that has something to do with it, is all I'm saying.
maybe there still are powerful factions in the establishment who are willing to use the UFO subject as a smear. Like, so it's not
For
a
sure.
unified thing.
It's not totally
And
unified.
I could easily see UFOs coming under someone's radar crosshairs, and they want to take us down. And it could easily happen. Deplatforming could happen. YouTube, Twitter.
I don't want to talk about it.
All right, yeah. This gets Tracy nervous. I bring this up all the time privately,
I don't
all
even
the
want to
time.
talk about it.
And
Yeah.
she's like, let's not get into that
Let's
right
just keep going, and yeah, for now. So I really like this question. This is way back, and we might not, probably won't get into this tonight, but I just love the question. This is from DJN Phase. Any thoughts on the possibility of advanced alien AI guiding disclosure? Incredible topic, by the way. Totally agree. Maybe not for tonight, but for another time.
now. Okay, let me just get that.
that.
Advanced alien AI guiding disclosure.
I love that exploration.
Well,
We can go into that another time when we're sort of focused on.
here's one thing I'll say. If there's one area in which you might hypothesize these other beings guiding us, you can go, and I know Valet explored this years ago, this idea that, sightings of these objects often seemed to involve technology that was like a little bit ahead of our own at the time. People often go back to the famous airship sightings of 1890s.
Okay.
But it wasn't just that. Like, there were a lot of sightings through the years even earlier than this or later of objects that were, generally speaking, seemingly identifiable as advanced airships, but that were of great maneuverability and so on. My point, and then you go back through the centuries, and there were other kinds of unusual sightings that people interpreted in the mentality of that era. And so the question might be, do these other beings appear in a way that allows us to have some kind of understanding of greater potential and greater possibilities? And I don't really know that that's the case. But there's this idea that there's a kind of leading us along.
I like that idea.
It would be nice. Like, if that were the case, that would be great. Then that means that they're kind of on our side, maybe. But there's other reasons to argue against that interpretation. So I don't know if we're ever really going to know enough about the ancient UFO phenomenon to know one way or the other. Truthfully, it's my own feeling. What you don't know, late at night, I do a lot of late night reading, and I've really been getting into early UFO reports. And I may come back to this in the future with some thoughts on it, but like really early reports. It's interesting.
So you don't want to mention anything about that? We're going to keep it at that?
Let's come back to it later.
Okay. Let's see. This is from Alan at New Realities, our friend. What was Hynek's response to the Condon report?
Greetings to Alan.
Hey, Alan.
I've known him very long. Alan Steinfeld, great guy. Everyone should know what Alan's work does. I'm serious. He's fabulous.
Totally agree.
Hynek's reaction, he was very critical of the Condon report. I'm trying to remember the specifics offhand, but he has 2 books. I've got them downstairs, 1 floor below. I could pull them up, but he was very disappointed and critical. When Hynek visited Boulder in 1966 to talk to the Colorado team, he had Valet with him, and he made a point to say to them, this really deserves a serious scientific investigation. And he wanted to be part of that. So by that point, Hynek, even years before, when he was not vocal about UFOs, was still of the opinion, to anyone who would listen, that this was a subject that really deserved not just more scientific analysis, but much better and interdisciplinary scientific analysis. And he had made this statement very clearly. So by 1966, Hynek had really had his kind of public conversion, so to speak, and was much more openly making these same statements. So he was very disappointed in the really lazy incompetent manner in which the Condon Committee was run.
Yeah, how sad that he was pushing for it. He thought that was the answer. That was the way it needed to go.
Yeah.
And then ultimately it was its greatest demise.
One of the things he did do, and I think this is very much to his credit, is he formed an organization called the Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS, really as a direct response to the failure of the Condon Committee. And in other words, wanting to bring scientific respectability back to the UFO subject. And really, there's no question that Hynek during the 70s was the leader of what became known as scientific ufology. This idea that UFOs could and should and needed to be studied in a scientific manner. The only problem with that is it's not that UFOs shouldn't be, they need to be, but good science requires money, and to do a genuine scientific investigation, you need resources, and that's never been the case with UFOs. Not in the private realm, not with CUFOs, not with MUFON, not with anyone. So, anything else we got here? Everything, I'm going to read this
This
from
is Domi.
Everything to cover up might be done for good reasons. Hell yes, absolutely. To protect us from what bad things some crazy individuals might do with the knowledge released. Absolutely. I've thought about this a lot, Domi. Thank you for asking. Someone who really strongly believes this is Stanton Friedman. Talked with him quite a lot about this, and he's made a lot of public statements. Think about it this way. Let's say implicit in the solution to the UFO mystery is a solution to our energy issues. So beyond petroleum. I've thought about this over and over again. Whatever is operating, whatever the energy source of these flying saucers may be, not gasoline, that's obvious. And I've always felt implicit in the solution to the UFO mystery is a post-petroleum world, at least in terms of energy. Sidebar, petroleum is really important in plastics, but in terms of energy, we use most of our petroleum for that, and it would transform our world. But what if also implicit in this energy solution are implications for really awesome weaponry? Totally possible. What if we, when we exploit something like 0-point energy, if that can create, Hal Puthoff put it this way one time. He says, look, we don't really know how much energy is contained within the 0-point energy field. Could be insignificant, but it might be just enough to have enough energy in a cup of coffee to evaporate the Pacific Ocean. That was, I think, how he put it. In other words, if that's true, you don't want just anyone having access to this. Right. In terms of weaponry, one of the things we have to assume, and we kind of actually know this is true, if you read things like, no relation here, but the Condon report. The Condon report
I wanted to mention
from the late 90s.
Yeah.
But in that's a UK report, and they talk about wanting to utilize UAP or UFO phenomenon for weapons applications. And so, that's a real concern. To let this out could cause a real destabilization in terms of weaponry. And so, you wonder, is the only way to release this information by creating a complete surveillance state so that you get into everyone's computer and you know what everyone's doing, so you make sure that they're not creating these weapons? Is that the answer? That's an awful thing to say, but is that the case? Like, we really have to ask ourselves these questions. And I more than anyone else that I know, I'm like fiercely independent, and so I don't want to go that way. But the other thing is, like, what if that's the case?
Right.
What if that is? I think I cut you off. You're about to say something.
If I was, I don't remember.
All
I've got other people's stuff in front of me, so I'm lining up a few things.
But we talked about the Condon thing before.
Yeah, I was saying a long time ago. I would hear Condon and Condon, and I was very confused about how I thought it was the same, because sometimes you'd hear it with different people's accents, and I didn't understand how I was hearing about it in the U.S. and hearing about it in the UK. Yeah. Clearly,
they're two
I
different
now
things.
know they're two totally different things.
Two totally different things. 30 plus years apart.
However, they're both extremely significant.
Yeah.
In what has come out of them. So
They both
interesting
are.
how close the name is.
Yeah, and they both are reports kind of in response to significant UFO activity, right? You know, the Condon report to the whole wave of sightings in the 60s, and Condon. Condon was more of an intelligence estimate done secretly at the time. But one of the things, of course, that popped up in there was the Rendlesham Forest case in 1980.
Yes, the implications of that, yes. From I Hail, Rich, will you be giving an in-depth talk on James E. McDonald? Always found him interesting.
Oh, that would be a great idea. Yeah, why not? I think that would be a very good thing to do. James McDonald was a really tragic figure in the history of not just UFOs, frankly, but in modern American history. He had a really tragic life. He was such a genial, brilliant man. Like, everyone loved James McDonald from what I could gather. But the real thing about McDonald is that he became this unstoppable force relating to UFOs when he began to realize the depths of secrecy that were happening. He made it a kind of a mission. He was like a one-man army. There's a scene, I think Valet again describes this. Valet and Hynek were very close during the 60s, and McDonald in 1966, I think in June or late spring of 66, comes into Hynek's office, all right, and literally fist on the table to Hynek, who was like really taken aback. Like, where the hell have you been with all these UFO reports? This is what I'm seeing, and you've just been basically sitting around doing nothing. And I think it really startled Hynek. Like, McDonald was a force and was angry. And I think it was one of the things that woke Hynek up a little bit. It kind of shamed him a little bit into a more public stance on UFOs because McDonald was just so good. The other thing about McDonald is he was an atmospheric physicist. And so he was really highly skilled at taking down the dumb astronomers, who would, well, they weren't dum-dums, but they would have these dumb explanations of UFOs. Astronomical explanations. McDonald was an atmospheric physicist. UFOs, 99% of them are seen where? In the atmosphere. That's his turf. No astronomer was going to be able to take down James McDonald with UFO explanations when you're dealing with sightings in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
He's going to win.
Yeah.
So he took all the explanations of Donald Menzel, the Harvard astronomer, who was the big UFO debunker, and he made Menzel's explanations look ridiculous, which they were. And Menzel had nothing he could do. It's like being in the ring with a Muhammad Ali in his prime. You're not going to win.
I would love for you. I'm going to second that. I'd love for you to tell that story and what happened.
Sure. Well, yeah, his life ended
it's kind of
tragically.
sad how it all ended.
Yeah.
But
So he self-inflicted gunshot wound. And in my first book, I had some speculations as to whether, to what extent was it an actual suicide or not. But I'll leave that for the next time. And I'm not sure if I'll ever know what the truth is about his demise, but it was a tragic end in 1971.
I think his is an important story to tell.
Very much so. Good book written about him by Ann Druffel called Firestorm. And before I do a talk on McDonald, I'll review that book.
Okay. This is from Rodney Boyer. This was earlier. Richard, do you believe that Condon knew that UFOs were real and tried to make everyone look stupid that brought the subject up to satisfy the military?
Oh, okay.
I
Did
know
I believe that
how
Condon
I
knew UFOs were
think
real?
about that, but what do you think?
Well, there's no.
Do you think he thought they were real?
In his private papers, I don't know of any evidence that he is like, yeah, let's keep the cover-up going. Like, I don't think Condon was doing that at all. Now, at various times, Condon did say things like, I don't believe the Air Force is hiding anything, and if they did, I wouldn't care. Like, he would say things like this.
Right.
And then his statement to Saunders during the operation of the program, he said, if we come to a positive conclusion, I'm taking it to the president. Things like that make you wonder. Did he suspect in the back of his mind that there was something to it?
Right.
you know,
I think it's a
don't
good
you agree
question,
that the
by the
human
way.
mind, we're complex, right? Like,
Mhm.
so what does a hardened skeptic really believe? How do we really think through things? Do we have just layers in our mind where we make a superficial conclusion and we don't go beyond it?
Right.
And I think with any of us, if we were to spend serious, quiet time with a subject, or to allow ourselves to open to it, we might be challenged by it. I can tell you from my own experience, when I first started looking into UFOs, I had that fear
Mhm.
that what if this is real?
Right.
Like there was a part of me that didn't want it to be real, because not because I didn't want to believe it, but because I didn't want to disrupt my life.
Right. Mhm.
Right? That's a real important thing.
Mhm.
No
Yeah.
one wants to disrupt their life. No one wants to say, if I believe this new thing, then I have to change all this other shit that I've been doing in my life all this time.
Yeah.
And like, no one wants to do that. No one wants to say, if I believe this new thing is real, then I have to acknowledge that the last 25 years of what I thought was true was not true, and I have to kind of reevaluate.
Mhm.
That's the most annoying thing. And there was a part of me in the early 90s, way back then, that did not want to have to reevaluate.
Mhm.
But in my case, I couldn't help it. Like, I had to do it, and I
Mhm.
forced myself to do it, and obviously I'm glad I did. But in the case of someone like Condon, how old was he? He was in his late 60s.
Mhm.
He was born in 1902, so he was in his mid-late 60s. He was an experienced, famous physicist. Like, there's no way he was going to unharden his mind
Yeah.
to that extent and say, wow, all this time, wow, fancy that.
Yeah.
I was wrong. Like, so I think people get to a point where they just shut a certain part of themselves down. No matter how intelligent someone is, I don't care how scientifically
Mhm.
qualified he was, he's still a human being
Yeah.
with emotional things going on that I
Mhm.
think would prevent him from going deeper. My take on it.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly made it seem like that this was just the whole subject was just a waste of his time. But who knows what the reality of that was?
I'm going to point out there's a little clock up there.
Okay, so you're giving me the wrap it up signal.
I think we need to I'm just saying.
Okay.
What do you think?
All right. Okay.
It's fun.
Yes.
I mean, I'm not
I
denying
know we've been going for quite some time, and this is going to be the last one. We're not going to be joining you, unfortunately, because it will be Christmas next Tuesday, and but we will be back the week after.
What if I drag you on to
on Christmas Day?
On the UFOs the Big Picture? Maybe I'll do one of that. We'll bring you out.
Maybe not on Tuesday. I mean,
like on Saturday.
On Saturday.
On Saturday.
Maybe. Well, let's see.
Maybe a little surprise.
What we decide to talk about. That would be pretty cool.
Those are usually short. Those are like 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, they're
half
great.
Hour most.
Okay, so let's wrap it up. Let's just talk about a few last minute things. And but first, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for being here. It's amazing having everybody in chat. It's really fun when you get to see people sharing information. I know I talk about this sometimes. I'm not with the chat the whole time, but I love when I see that back and forth going on and people commenting on what you're saying and
great
and adding to it. You know, a very cool discussion of discovery and exploration.
I hope people understand. I have to turn the chat off when I'm speaking in here because it gets
distracted.
Way too, But I'm glad that you have it on your computer.
Yes. So thank you to everyone for coming to the show, supporting us, subscribing, liking.
Subscribe to the channel if you like what you see. Like the video if you like what you see. And check out the newsletter. I would just say, I like talking it up. Tracy creates it. It's beautiful every week. I don't think anyone, honestly, in this field has a newsletter that looks as great. And it's all because of her. It's an amazing, every week it comes out.
The newsletter is basically, just a way for all of you to keep up on what we're releasing through the week. So we put in there all of the free content. You can also sort of see what the members are getting for content every week. Then we add other things in. So this past week, History Channel was in our home, as I was saying, and they were recording Richard. So I put in a little snippet, a little excerpt of the video I recorded behind the scenes in the newsletter. It's kind of a big newsletter, but if you go all the way down, I try and throw something interesting and different in there every week, whether it's fan art or who knows what.
So we put 30 minutes actually on the members side. So you have to be a member for 30 minutes of the clip, but 4 minutes are totally on the newsletter, but it's not on YouTube. It is on YouTube, but it's unlisted. So you've got to go to the newsletter.
It's only for our newsletter people. Yeah.
And you can watch those 4 minutes that way though. So that's our little sneakiness. But look, that's the way it is.
Yeah, we just
go to the newsletter.
We want to make it fun.
Click, watch, enjoy.
Yeah. Happy holidays to everyone.
Yes.
And we want to thank Lori and Michael as always. They are amazing. Pursuing X, we could not do it without you. Thank you.
It's been a great year.
It has been a great year.
Oh, you're getting a little.
I am. We got married this year.
We got married this year. We personally have had a great year. It's been wonderful, obviously, and doing this with you, it could not have been better.
Yeah,
that's the truth.
Year.
And we will be back after Christmas, so it's not the end of the year, but it's getting close there, right? It's been wonderful.
Yep. So we'll look forward tomorrow. In case you didn't hear, we are going to be live interviewing David O'Leary, the creator of Project Blue Book. So we're really looking forward to that. 3
p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific.
Right.
It'll be on the YouTube channel right here.
Okay.
All right. That's it, everyone. Have a great night.
Wonderful night. We'll see you tomorrow. If not, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to everyone.
Absolutely. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Later.